Patricia O Connor was the middle child of 13 siblings, and she originally came from Windgap in County Kilkenny. Her father, Patrick Cook, worked in forestry, and her mother, Helen, was at home looking after their 13 children. In interviews with Patricia's family, she was described as very like her mother. She loved to cook and clean the house. They had a garden where they grew vegetables, and she was great at looking after her younger siblings, helping her mother at all costs. I think in a family of that size, all hands were on deck. You had your chores and duty to help out, and Patricia, being the middle child, was no different. Her childhood would have been described as idyllic in a hard-working country life way. By no way did they live in abundance, but they had food in their bellies, a roof over their heads, and maybe not a bed to themselves, but that's how you kept warm at night. Oh, and of course, there was love in the house. When Patricia turned 16, she decided to spread her wings and head to the big smoke of Dublin to look for work. It was a sensible thing to do, as there was not many opportunities in Kilkenny at the time, and her older siblings had made their move to Dublin, so she followed suit. She first got a job at Kappa Hospital, doing cleaning and general work. She met her husband Gus, and they got married while Patricia was still quite young. They lived in a small flat near Donnybrook, and her younger sister remembers visiting her there, and she loved it, as they lived opposite a popcorn factory, and she loved the smell. Then in time Patricia and Gus got a council house in Rathfarnham, which they would eventually decide to take a mortgage out and buy from the council. Patricia always worked. There was never a time she didn't, even when she had her 2 children, Louise and Richard. Patricia would also have her family from Windgap come stay with her for the school holidays. Her sister Rita would say, quote, "Patricia had a very motherly instinct about her. She was always taking care of us, and when she'd come home to Windgap, she'd bring bags of clothes with her for everyone." To show you more of the kindness of Patricia, Colette, Patricia's sister, told her story of getting pregnant when she was 16, while still living at home in Windgap. Of course, this would have been a big scandal in rural Ireland in the 80s. Their parents were mortified and thought she was bringing shame on the family. But Patricia stepped in and told her parents, quote, "Don't worry, she can come stay with me in Dublin." Colette got to keep her baby, and she would say that's where her life began. She lived with Patricia and her little family for nearly 5 years. Colette would say, quote, "If she hadn't taken me in, I'd hate to think where I'd have ended up. I've a lot to thank her for. My own mother didn't want me at home." Colette would go on to say, in all the time her and her daughter lived with her, she never saw Patricia lose her temper once. She was so easygoing. Gus and Patricia would go on to separate, and Patricia would move out of the house for several years. She would move back into the house around 2007, after a failed relationship with another woman that she met in work. This relationship did not end well, and Patricia was left in an apartment in the city, trying to pay rent and bills, while also paying towards the mortgage in Mountain View Park in Rathfarnham. As Gus and Patricia were still on good terms, Patricia made the decision to move back into the house, but she wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. Gus and herself did not live as husband and wife, sleeping in separate bedrooms. It was a 4-bedroom terrace house with a nice back garden. Patricia was very house-proud and loved her garden. By 2016, Patricia decided to retire at 60, and so she would be at home full-time. She had worked in Beaumont Hospital on and off for 30 years, and everyone was sad to see her go, as she was so jolly and happy. She'd sing and chat to the patients and went out of her way to get to know them. She was a great addition to the crew there, and she was going to be greatly missed. This, though, is where the nightmare began when she retired. Her son Richard had moved out and was doing his own thing. Her daughter Louise, on the other hand, was troublesome to say the least. She had 5 children with 2 different men. The oldest 2 belonged to Keith Johnston, and the other 3 belonged to Kieran Green. Louise, Kieran, and the 5 children all lived with Gus and Patricia in the 4-bedroom house, along with cats, dogs and budgies. So 9 people in total. I would tear my hair out, but not Patricia. She welcomed them with open arms. She loved her children and loved her grandchildren. and they were what kept her going, and she would light up when they were around. She was always singing and dancing with them, said the family. By the time Patricia was ready to retire in 2016, there was a fair bit of friction in the house. Patricia was the type to be a straight shooter. If you were in the wrong, she'd tell you, and if you needed a kick in the arse, she'd gladly give you one. Patricia was very house proud, always folding clothes, hoovering and cleaning. But with everyone living with her, it was tough, coming home from work over the years and having to do everything. This is where most of the arguments stem from. She would ask everyone to help out. Louise wouldn't tidy up after herself, let alone the children, and Kieran was a good for nothing. Gus was extremely passive, but would take Louise aside if push came to shove. At 5'2" and a petite build, Patricia, with a big heart, would put up with a lot, but she was getting into her later years, and she wanted things right in her home that she was paying for. She also took great pride in her appearance. She loved her red hair, she got laser eye treatment and got her teeth fixed. She wore lovely clothes and loved colour. The first time the family knew of Patricia going missing was when her sister Valerie, who lived close to Patricia's home, bumped into Gus while out walking her dog. He told Valerie that Patricia had packed a suitcase and left on the 29th of May 2017, and he hadn't seen her since. That he and his son Richard had reported her missing, and Gardaí checked hotels, women's shelters, and noted that Patricia's bank card had not been used since the 29th of May. Gardaí also contacted Patricia's daughter Louise to get a photograph of Patricia to notify the public that she was missing. Valerie notified the rest of the family of what Gus had told her, and it was then that the whole family came together to look for Patricia also. On Saturday, the 10th of June 2017, it was a warm sunny day, which is rare here in Ireland. A family were out hiking and picnicking in the Wicklow Mountains. Late in the evening, at around 7:45 p.m, the family returned to their car on the old military road, only to realise that their car had been broken into. A handbag had been taken, and so they searched the area to see if any of the items in the handbag had been discarded nearby. The military road cuts through a bog that covers the Wicklow Mountains, and the road edge is covered in ferns and long lush grass. As the group began searching the verges, they came upon what they thought to be the remains of a pig carcass, but on closer inspection they realised that it was part of a human torso. They ended up calling the Gardaí, and when they arrived at the scene, they confirmed that indeed it was human. A large-scale search of the mountains was launched, and members of the Irish Army and Civil Defence were drafted in to help, as they felt sure that other body parts had been disposed of in the same way, and most probably they would find them along the roadside verge. Throughout the next few days, limbs and body parts were found along a 25-kilometre stretch of the old military road. The Gardaí felt that all the body parts were thrown from a moving vehicle. Initially, the Gardaí thought that the body parts were male, but as more body parts were recovered, it was realised that they belonged to an older woman. But this would not be discovered for a few days. Meanwhile, when word got out that a dismembered body had been found in the Wicklow Mountains, a man in his 30s turned up at the Garda station in Rathfarnham on the 12th of June. He was turning himself in relation to the death of a woman and the disposing of her body. The man told them how he had buried a body in Wexford, that it was the body of his girlfriend's mother, that he had killed her in self-defence and drove her to Wexford and buried her there. The Gardaí straight away brought the man to Wexford, and the man brought them to the site where he had buried the body. Here they would find a makeshift grave in a farmer's field in Blackwater in County Wexford, where they found teeth and hair, but no body. The man in question was there and then arrested. 9 separate locations were cordoned off as crime scenes when it was realised that the body in the mountains was female, and Gardaí got more information from the man they arrested. The field in Wexford, several locations on Military Road, and a house in Mountain View Park in Rathfarnham were included as crime scenes. Gardaí, once they had connected the dots and got the full story from the man that had turned himself in, they knew it was their missing person, Patricia. Initially, her body was buried in Wexford, but then 2 days later she was dug up and then dismembered and scattered across the mountains. The Gardaí at this stage had no weapons, but upon post-mortem of the body parts, it was believed that a hacksaw, a hatchet and maybe an electric saw was used to cut up the body. The Gardaí put out an appeal to the public in search of these items. On the morning of the 15th of June, the 32-year-old man was brought to Bray Garda Station, where he was charged with the murder of Patricia, and brought before Tallaght District Court to be formally charged. He was named Kieran Green, with an address at Mountain View Park, the same address as Patricia. Kieran was the father to 3 of Patricia's grandchildren and partner to her daughter Louise. Kieran pleaded not guilty and declared it was self-defence. He was remanded in custody and granted free legal aid. Meanwhile, searches were continuing in Wexford, the Wicklow Mountains and the house in Mountain View Park. Neighbours were questioned and CCTV footage was collected, including footage from the house right next door to Patricia's house. They had cameras facing the back and front gardens of Patricia's house. Patricia's funeral took place in private at the end of July. Her daughter Louise wanted it this way in order to give the family a chance to grieve the loss of her mother in private and out of the public eye. Patricia was cremated with only her immediate family present. Her sisters would later say that they don't know who made this decision to make it private, as so many people that loved her didn't get to say goodbye. She was loved by so many, from the people she grew up with in Winegap to her work colleagues and friends she made over the years. They would say it was very strange. On Saturday, the 2nd of September 2017, 3 people were arrested in connection to Patricia's death. A 73-year-old man was arrested in County Meath. A 19-year-old woman and a 38-year-old woman were arrested in Dublin. All 3 were released without charge. At the end of September, a 40-year-old man was arrested and brought in for questioning at Bray Garda Station. He was named as Keith Johnston, who was Patricia's daughter's ex-partner and father to her 2 eldest children. By the end of 2017, Gardaí presented a file to the DPP and a court date was set for December 2018 for Kieran Green. In early January 2018, Gardaí divers searched the banks of the River Dodder because of information they received about the disposal of items that were used to dismember Patricia. 2 hacksaws and a hatchet were recovered. In October 2018, 4 people appeared at Tallaght District Court in Dublin, charged with impeding the Garda investigation into the murder of Patricia. The people that were arrested were Patricia's husband Gus, her daughter Louise and granddaughter Stephanie, and Keith Johnston. They were all accused of frustrating Gardaí's efforts to find out about what happened to Patricia on the night of the 29th of May 2017. All 4 were charged and granted bail on a bond of €200 each, and they had to sign on weekly at their local Garda station, surrender their passports, and free legal aid was granted. After the 4 were charged, it was decided by the courts that they would all be tried together along with Kieran Green, who was charged with Patricia's murder. They would have to wait until January 2019 before a new date would be set for the trial. On January 14, 2020, jury selection began for the trial of Green, Gus, Louise, Stephanie and Keith. The jury were warned that the trial would be lengthy and details of what happened to Patricia would be disturbing. The jury was told that Gus, Louise, Stephanie and Keith all acted to protect Green from being apprehended. The jury heard how Stephanie disguised herself as her grandmother and left the house the night of the 29th of May 2017, carrying a suitcase to make it look like Patricia had left of her own accord. But what the family didn't realise was their next door neighbour had CCTV footage, not only facing the front of the house, but the back also, and it captured Stephanie leaving the house by the front door and going around the block and returning later by the back entrance of the house and in the back door. When this was put to Louise in Garda interviews, all she was concerned was the fact that the neighbours had cameras facing their house and the legality of it. Keith was accused of helping Green buy tools in order to cut up Patricia's body and help bury and hide her. He also refurbished the bathroom at the Mountain View house in order to destroy or conceal evidence. All four had pleaded not guilty to the charges. On opening statement, the prosecution told how Patricia's remains had been found in 15 parts over 9 different locations in the Wicklow Mountains, from the Glen MacNass waterfall to Sally Gap to Glen Cree. It was explained how they all lived with Patricia in the house, along with Louise's 5 children, but that Keith Johnston did not live there. This led to the house being crowded and tensions were high, as they all tried to live in such cramped conditions. It was the state's belief that Green had killed Patricia in the bathroom of the home by hitting her over the head with a hurley. In case you don't know, a hurley is a hockey-type stick used in an outdoor team game. Hurling is native to our country and is known as the fastest game on grass, and it dates back 4,000 years. This is what Green told Gardaí when he presented himself to them before the body parts in the Wicklow Mountains were identified as Patricia. His second interview with Gardaí produced a different story as to what had happened to Patricia that fateful night. He pushed the blame on the other accused. He told Gardaí that he had been persuaded to take the blame by other family members. Gardaí told the court how they had visited the family home of Patricia when she was first reported missing, and they had met her daughter Louise. Louise had explained how hard things had become in the house since Patricia had retired the year before. She said Patricia had become extremely hard to live with. There were constant arguments about what Louise deemed as trivial matters, and the night Patricia disappeared was one of those arguments. She had fought with Patricia over receipts and car insurance, and she said that Patricia tried to strike her over the head with the teapot. Louise also claimed that they fought because she refused to go out and buy cannabis for her mother, that she was addicted to it. Later autopsy results would find no traces of cannabis. Louise would tell Gardaí that after this row she went with her children and her father to the park. Green would stay behind, and then he and Patricia got into an argument when Patricia walked into the bathroom while Green was in the shower. When Louise and the children got back to the house, she noted that Green was stressed out and Patricia was storming around the house giving out. Gus had stayed in the park to walk the dog. Louise then told Gardaí that around 9:30 p.m. she heard the front door bang shut, and when she went out to see who had gone out, she saw her mother go up the road and thought that she was carrying a suitcase. She said the next morning when she got up, Green was in the bathroom doing some work. She said her mother had been at him to do it for ages, and he was anxious to get it done before Patricia came home. Keith Johnston was also there giving him a hand. She said despite Keith being an ex of hers, he and Green got on well. Louise also told Gardaí that on the day Green turned himself in, he was fierce upset and kept hugging her and the children and crying, saying, quote, "I'm sorry, I've hurt your mam, I didn't mean to. She was lashing at me with a hurl." Green had said that Patricia had returned after leaving the house that night and they had ended up on the floor fighting. He said he didn't know what happened. He panicked and now felt he needed to turn himself in. Another Garda that took to the stand spoke of how he first met Green and how he had turned up at the Garda station in Rathfarnham. He said Green came across as nervous and asked to speak to someone in charge. He told Gardaí over 4 interviews how he had killed Patricia and disposed of her body by loading her into the boot of her own car and driving her to Wexford, where he proceeded to dig a shallow grave with his hands and a stick. He told Gardaí how he couldn't live with himself for what he had done and how he had let his children down, that he wanted to raise his children to always do the right thing, and here he was after killing their grandmother. He told Gardaí that he went back 2 days later and dug up the body and tried to move it, but found it too hard to move, and so decided to cut up the body to make it easier. Green told Gardaí that the row between him and Patricia happened around midnight on the 29th of May. After Patricia left the house earlier that night, everyone went to bed, but he stayed up and was in the living room. When he went to the bathroom, Patricia returned home and opened the door of the bathroom. He said Patricia started screaming at him and attacked him with a hurley. He said Patricia hit him on the arm with the hurley, and after this he blacked out, waking up to Patricia on the ground. He saw a pool of blood beside her and thought she had fallen and hit her head. In a panic, he brought Patricia upstairs, but then realised she was dead and dragged her back down again and put her in the boot of her own car and drove her to Wexford. He told Gardaí that he went back to the field to recover Patricia as he was afraid she'd be found, and he didn't want to put the farmer through an ordeal of having to find the body and put his partner Louise and the children through the fact that she had not gone away but was dead. Green decided to dig up Patricia and move her to the mountains where she would most likely never be found. He told Gardaí he was unable to move the body, and so he decided to cut it up for ease, and said how he had cried and vomited in the process. He then loaded the body parts into the car and drove towards the Dublin mountains. After passing the viewing point of Mount Pellier Hill, or better known to some as the Hellfire Club, which has an interesting history, Green decided to start dumping the bags from here all the way down Military Road as far as the Glen MacNass waterfall. When he was done, he said he got back in the car and cried. He then got rid of the mat from the car, the hurley Patricia had used on him, the bags, the saw, and his clothing. He told Gardaí that he could not remember where he dumped these items. He said eventually he told Louise what he had done, and she was shocked. Then it was time to blacken poor Patricia's name to justify what he and other family members had done to her. Green had said Patricia was a nightmare to live with, and they all lived in fear of her. This intensified when she retired and was at home full time. He said that Patricia was making genuine attempts to kill members of the family. Louise had an adverse reaction to a glass of Coca-Cola she was drinking, and she was allergic to penicillin. He had also stated that Patricia had asked them to kill her husband Gus, saying she would sign the house over to Louise, and if Louise was caught, she could blame her Graves' disease. He said he did not plan or intend to kill Patricia. His only concern was to keep his children safe from the fear that Patricia had caused in the household. He insisted that Keith Johnston had nothing to do with Patricia's death, and that he and Louise only found out what he had done the day before he turned himself in. But there were inconsistencies with what Green had told them. What Green had said he had done to Patricia did not match the condition the body was found in. The state pathologist took to the stand and stated that no drugs were found, but there were some alcohol found in Patricia's system. The cut marks found on the bones indicated that a power tool was mostly used, but when it came to the hands and feet, the cuts were different, and he indicated that a hacksaw was used. There was also several lacerations found to the head and scalp, and fractures to the skull, which to the pathologist was the cause of death. On the 23rd of January 2020, the court heard that Green had retracted his statement in December of 2017 and told the Gardaí that he had not actually killed Patricia. What Green had said about how the row had started that night on the 29th of May, he stood by, but what he changed was that Gus had come downstairs with something in his hand which looked like a crowbar. He said Gus confronted Patricia in the bathroom over what she was doing to Green. Patricia turned to take a swing at Gus with the hurley, and Gus hit her on the head with the bar he was holding. When Patricia fell to the ground dead, Gus told Green, quote, "I did this to protect you, so you can take the rap for this." Green went on to say that everyone in the house went into a panic, and that they all had a hand in putting Patricia into the boot of her car. He drove down to Wexford while Louise cleaned up. Keith Johnston was told what had happened that night, and Green had asked him for help. They both went to where Patricia was buried, and they both dug her up and cut up her body and dispersed her body over the mountains. He said he had lied in the beginning, as he was persuaded to take the fall for everyone. He felt that Louise and Keith were going to get back together while he was inside, and that it was all planned to get him out of the way so they could get back together. After this evidence was read out, the judge announced to the jury that anything that was read out in the statement couldn't be used against any of the co-accused. A statement that was made to Gardaí by Stephanie, Patricia's granddaughter, was then read out to the court. Stephanie said that the relationship between her mother and grandmother was very strained. Patricia was described as difficult and made Louise's life hard. She also said that poor Patricia liked to make people unhappy and was a bully. Stephanie also said on the night Patricia died, she had heard nothing and slept through the whole night. She said she did not find out what had happened until Green confessed to the whole family. Along with all the other statements, Keith Johnston also made a statement to Gardaí. He told the Gardaí that Stephanie, his daughter, had told him in early June that Patricia had gone missing. He also admitted doing some work in the bathroom of the house in Mountain View Park. He said that he did not know what he was doing on the 29th of May and denied assisting Green in the disposal and cover-up, that it was just a coincidence that he did the work on the bathroom after Patricia went missing. The jury were once again reminded that the contents of each statement mentioning a co-accused could not be used against them as a sign of guilt. CCTV footage was then shown of Green and Keith shopping together, buying items that would eventually be found by the Dodder River, including a hatchet, a hacksaw and heavy-duty plastic bags that the body parts were found in. The neighbour's footage was next shown to the jury. It showed a woman leaving the O'Connor's house at around 9:34 p.m. on the night of the 29th of May 2017, walking out onto the street and taking a left towards Nutgrove Shopping Centre. When Louise had been shown this footage, she said it was her mother. At around 10 p.m, the same figure returned, and again Louise said she thought it was her mother. It would later be determined that the person who left the house and returned was Stephanie, pretending to be her grandmother, and the figure shown at the back of the house was Stephanie sneaking back in. The suitcase that was being carried by Stephanie was later found by Gardaí in Gus's bedroom, and Louise confirmed that it looked like the same suitcase, but could have been one of a set. Louise denied that it was Stephanie in the footage. Stephanie's statement said that it was her grandmother leaving the house on the CCTV footage at around 9:30 p.m, and the footage from the rear at around 10 p.m. was her. She reckoned it was her getting a bag from the shed that her mother had asked her to get. Stephanie denied killing her grandmother or assisting anyone in covering up her murder. Richard, Patricia and Gus's son, took to the stand. He told the court that he had not lived in the house for 12 years, but he did know there was tension in the house with so many people living there. He said he knew that Louise did nothing to help out in the house, and Kieran was next to useless. Richard was told by the family that Patricia left the house on the 29th of May 2017, and because Patricia had not contacted him for his birthday, he called to the house in Mountain View Park to see what was going on. When he heard his mother was gone, he wanted to report her missing, as did Gus, but Louise did not want to. Richard was also shown the CCTV footage from the neighbour's house, and he confirmed that it was indeed his niece Stephanie. Richard also told the court that since his mother went missing, his father Gus had been staying with him. His father evicted Louise and her children from the house, but still continued to live with him. He said that Green was a bit of a fool, and it was Louise that wore the pants in the relationship. 343 hours of footage were collected in total, and the jury were brought through every part of it. It took 2 days to go through all the relevant footage. Footage was shown of the early hours of the 30th of May, of Green walking down by the side of the house, carrying 2 long-handled objects. A few minutes later, at the front of the house, Patricia's car was reversed into the driveway, and a male figure carried items from the house to the car. It also showed Gus at the front of the house, walking around to the back. At 2:10 a.m, the car left the house, and Green was picked up getting petrol at a petrol station, and the car returned to the house at 6:05 a.m. Gus was arrested on the strength of this footage, as the Gardaí believed he knew Patricia was dead when he reported her missing, and therefore impeded the investigation. Gus pleaded guilty to these charges just before the trial began. On Friday the 14th of February 2020, charges against Kevin Johnston relating to the destruction of evidence by refurbishing the bathroom were withdrawn, but he still faced a charge of being with Green when he purchased items to dispose of the body, that he impeded the investigation. The closing statement from the prosecution began on the 17th of February 2020. The prosecution told the jury to take into consideration Green's first statement made to Gardaí, that what Green had said about striking Patricia on the head aligned with her injuries. She said that Green had killed Patricia because of how he and the others in the house felt about her. She said the whole family worked together to bring a narrative that Patricia had left the house of her own accord, and when Green came forward and the body was discovered, they continued with the same narrative. The prosecution told the jury that they had a right to consider self-defence in relation to the charge against Green, but Green himself said the fight went on for at least 20 minutes and there was no defence wounds found on Patricia, therefore no basis for self-defence. The prosecution also said Green only changed his statement in December of 2017 because he was jealous of the rekindling of the relationship between Louise and Keith. His first telling of what happened that night and the days after was consistent and matched the evidence. Louise was also mentioned in the support of her daughter dressing up as her grandmother to try and show that Patricia was alive and well. CCTV footage of Patricia earlier that day showed that she was wearing a flower pattern dress, and fabric found in the shallow grave matched this. But when she was to have supposedly left the house that night carrying a suitcase, she was wearing blue jeans and a green coat. The walk was also different to how Patricia walked. The prosecution said that Louise lied about everything and knew exactly what had happened that night, that she had lied to the Gardaí. It took a full day for the prosecution to close and go through each defendant's role in the killing and the cover-up of Patricia. The defence on behalf of Green stated to the jury that the prosecution wanted them to consider Green's statements as truth and lies in accordance with what suited their case. The original statement from Green mentioned no one else but him, but here the others were sitting in court accused of helping him and covering up the killing. He said that Green's initial statement was false and the one made in December of 2017 was the truth. Green was seen as the fool in the house, a bit of a donkey that was in the house but not treated as part of the family. Green's state of mind on that night in May was simply to protect his family, that when he made his initial statement it was to keep his children's mother with them. But then, when evidence started to come through and everyone was being arrested, there was no point in keeping up the charade, and so this is why he changed his story that December. The defence for Stephanie then spoke. They asked the jury why Stephanie would dress up as her grandmother and knowingly allowed the neighbour's camera to pick her up leaving the house and returning a half an hour later by the back gate. But we do know that the O'Connors didn't know about the camera pointing to the back of the house. Again, the defence accused the prosecution of cherry-picking to suit their narrative. Louise's defence said there was no proof that Louise acted in any way to cover up her mother's murder. He said guilt by association was not a way to convict someone. When it was brought up that Louise had lied to the Gardaí, the jury were asked to consider that she lied to protect her daughter and not because she was trying to cover up the murder. When Richard testified in court that his sister Louise tried to dissuade him from reporting their mother missing, it was the first they all had heard of this. Richard has said no such thing to any Gardaí over the course of the investigation. Keith Johnston's defence told the jury that his client shouldn't be found guilty for just being present when Green purchased the tools to dismember Patricia. He said Keith had no idea what the tools were for. Keith said he had not been to the house until after Patricia went missing, and in Green's first statement to Gardaí, he said Keith had no idea of what he had done. Phone records also showed that Keith had never been to Wexford. Before the jury retired to deliberate, the judge dispensed his charge to them, which took several days. He reminded the jury for the last time that any statements from the co-accused that mentioned other co-accused could not be used against them. Different outcomes were put to the jury for all four defendants. For Green, a verdict of guilty of murder, and if they thought it was an act of self-defence, guilty of manslaughter. They were to put it out of their minds of how Patricia was found and to leave their emotions to the side. The fact that Gus had pleaded guilty for falsely reporting Patricia missing when he knew she was already dead was irrelevant. Green was the first to hear his verdict. He was found guilty of the murder of Patricia. Stephanie was next to be deliberated over, and the verdict was guilty of impeding the prosecution of Green. Louise was then considered in the jury's deliberations, and she also was found guilty of impeding the prosecution of Green. The final verdict came the following day when Keith Johnston was found guilty of impeding the prosecution of Green. When the trial ended, the family of Patricia gave a statement on the courthouse steps. They thanked the judge, the jury, the Gardaí, and all those who worked so hard to bring justice to Patricia. They acknowledged the family who discovered the part remains of Patricia and know it will probably affect them for the rest of their lives. They also said they were pleased with the verdict, but had been disgusted by how Patricia had been portrayed in the trial. It was in March 2020 when sentencing was to be handed down, but COVID hit and everything shut down, including court services. Green remained on remand and the other four all remained out on bail. In June of 2020, sentencing and victim impact statements were read out in court. Richard, Patricia's son, told the judge that he had been sickened by the lies said about his mother in court. He said, quote, "My mam was a kind, loving person with many years left to live that were so cruelly taken from her. The sentences that will be given today will not be enough for the crime they have committed. May they live with it on their conscience for the rest of their lives." Green received the mandatory life sentence, backdated to June 2017. The judge said he was appalled at the roles each of the family members before him took in covering up the murder of their wife, mother and grandmother, Patricia. Although Louise and Stephanie now accept the jury's verdict, he was not convinced that he knew the full scale of what exactly happened that night on the 29th of May 2017. Louise was sentenced to 3 years, Stephanie to 2 years, with 6 months suspended. Gus was handed down an 18-month term, and finally Keith Johnston was handed down 3 years. Green and Keith both lodged appeals in August 2020. None of the others put in for an appeal. Gus O'Connor was the first to be released from prison. He inherited the house Patricia was murdered in, later selling it for the sum of €350,000. Gus died in early 2022 and Louise was excluded from the death notice. Gus also cut her out of his will, leaving her nothing. He would also say after the trial that he suffered parental abuse at the hands of Louise, and so it is thought that this was another reason she got nothing. When Gus got out of prison, he went to live with his son Richard. When Richard was asked about his father, he would say, quote, "He has paid for his lies." Stephanie was released from prison in February 2021 after serving just 8 months of her 18-month sentence. She has not been in the public eye since her release. Louise was released in May of 2022 after spending 23 months in prison. She was provided with accommodation under the scheme set up for newly released prisoners. Green remains behind bars and is unlikely to be released prior to 2040. Keith Johnson was released in September 2022. Photographs show him happy and tanned. You'd think he had been away on holiday and not in prison. As one newspaper said, he looks better now than before he went into prison. So Sinead, which is Irish for "that's it." Another case with many twists and turns. This family was what nightmares are made of. It's no truer to say you can pick your friends but you can't pick your family. I think Patricia was a fierce Irish mammy who wasn't afraid to use the wooden spoon. Or maybe she didn't use it enough considering how her daughter turned out. She worked hard all her life, from the time she was in Winegap to her life in Dublin. I'd say nothing came easy to her. She had to work hard for everything she had, and there's no shame in trying to keep right what she had, her house and garden. Patricia was a straight shooter, but it was also obvious she was a softie. There is no way I'd have 9 people living in a 4-bedroom house and 5 of them children. They'd wreck me head. But I also wouldn't see them out on the street. With that many people in the house, they had to be rules and help to keep things running smoothly. I don't buy that Patricia was such a way. I'd say she was driven cracked, watching her and her beautiful house being disrespected and turned into a dump. Even the Gardaí mentioned the state of the place when they were there. Patricia was a dote, and like all my victims, I won't have a bad word said about her. Rest in peace, my lovely.